The man kneeling in the aisle of the first-class cabin was 32 years old, his hands steady despite the chaos around him. His name was Julian Cross, and he had one hand pressed against the neck of a stranger and the other holding a glass vial he'd just snapped open with his teeth. The stranger dying in front of him, gray-lipped, collar torn open, silk tie yanked loose across a custom charcoal suit, was Alessandro Ricci, 36 years old. The third-generation head of a Chicago family, most people only mentioned in whispers. Two of Alessandro's men stood over him, doing everything wrong. One had already emptied an emergency injector into his boss's thigh. Nothing had happened. He was reaching for a second when Julian pushed past him and said the thing nobody in that cabin understood. Don't. It isn't the dose. That medicine's bad. 200 passengers had their phones up. Not one of them stepped forward. So a man in a faded gray sweater and worn jeans, a man who scrubbed floors at a bus terminal from midnight until morning, took a billionaire's face in both hands and told him he wasn't going to die on that airplane. 90 seconds later, he brought him back. And then Julian did the thing that had millions of people searching for him by sunrise. He let go of Alessandro's hand, walked to the back of the plane, picked up his sleeping 4-year-old son, and disappeared. No name. No thank you. Not $1. Here's the part that'll stay with you. Julian wasn't running because he was humble. He was running because of something that happened to him 4 years earlier. Something he'd never told a living soul. And if he'd stayed in that aisle 60 seconds longer, he'd have lost the only thing he had left. What he couldn't have known, carrying his little boy down that jet bridge, was that the man whose life he'd just saved was about to hand him back the one thing he'd stopped believing he'd ever get again. The phone vibrated before dawn had fully broken, just as Julian Cross reached his apartment after the night shift, and before he'd even had time to take off his wet shoes. He looked at the number on the screen and knew immediately it was the hospice in Nashville, because nowhere else would call him at this hour. The man on the other end spoke very gently, with the kind of gentleness people learn after years of delivering bad news, and said that Ruth Vandermeer had awakened during the night asking where her little Julian was, and that if Julian wanted to see her, he should come now and not wait until the weekend. Julian stood motionless in the kitchen, his hands still smelling of floor cleaner, and heard himself say thank you in a perfectly calm voice. The voice he'd trained himself to use after so many years of taking calls whose contents could bring an entire life crashing down. He didn't sit. He walked straight into the bedroom, woke his son, and while helping the little boy into his clothes, he heard Oliver ask sleepily where they were going today. "Daddy," Oliver said, rubbing his eyes. "Where are we going?" Julian told him they were going to visit Grandma Ruth. "Do you remember Grandma? She's the woman who used to braid Daddy's hair when Daddy was your age." Into an old cloth bag with a broken strap that had been sewn back together with a different color of heavy thread, Julian packed 2 changes of clothes, a box of cookies, and the small plastic case containing Oliver's medicine, which he always kept in the outermost pocket so he could reach it immediately. Phoenix Airport was already crowded at that hour, and when Julian pushed the bag toward the counter, he saw the expression on the employee's face and knew everything had gone wrong before the man even opened his mouth. The flight was full. There wasn't a single seat left. The employee said he was very sorry, ma'am, then caught himself, glanced at Julian's tired face, and the little boy pressed against his leg, and corrected himself. "Sir, I'm very sorry, sir. I can put you on tomorrow morning's flight, and give you a meal voucher while you wait. That's the best I can do." Julian didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry either. There had been a time when he cried easily, but that time had passed long ago. Now, when everything collapsed around him, the only thing left inside was a cold stillness that frightened even him. He placed both hands on the counter, rough hands with fingertips cracked from years of chemicals, and lowered his voice until the people waiting behind him couldn't hear. He said he understood. He wasn't blaming anyone. But there was a man lying in Nashville waiting for him, and that man had already spent Julian's entire childhood waiting for him. He said that when he'd been a child, nobody wanted to take him. No one had stepped forward and chosen him except that man. He said, "Please don't make him wait one more night for me, because I'm not sure he has another night left to wait." The employee looked at Julian, then looked down at Oliver, who stood pressed against his father's leg, one hand clutching the hem of Julian's gray sweater, looking up at the man behind the counter with clear eyes that belonged to the alpha he'd never met. Something inside the employee's chest softened. He raised one finger and said, "Wait here for just a moment." Then he picked up the phone and turned away. Julian barely dared to breathe. He'd stopped depending on hope a long time ago, because hope was a luxury people like him couldn't afford. But he still stood there watching the man's back, watching him nod, watching him put the receiver down and reach for the printer. "There are 2 seats at the very back," the employee said as he pushed 2 boarding passes across the counter. "I had to ask for them. Go quickly before they close the door." Julian took the 2 passes, and his hands began to shake. "Thank you. I'll remember this for the rest of my life. I mean that." He handed over the last credit card that still had room on it, and watched the card reader remain motionless for 2 seconds that felt as long as 2 years before it finally approved the charge. Then he lifted his son into his arms, swung the cloth bag over his shoulder, and ran. On the way down the boarding bridge, Oliver's shoes squeaked against the floor, and the little boy asked, "Daddy, can I sit by the window? I want to look down at the clouds." Julian told him, "Of course, baby. The whole window is yours." As Julian stepped into the cabin, his eyes swept over the emergency exit signs above, and he counted the rows between their seats and the nearest door. An old habit so deeply rooted that he did it without even realizing he was doing it. Then he settled Oliver into the inside seat, fastened the little boy's seat belt, and finally allowed his lungs to fill with one complete breath. Less than 100 steps from where Julian and his son were sitting, on the other side of the terminal inside a private lounge that most passengers could go their entire lives without ever knowing existed, Alessandro Ricci sat alone at the head of a table with an open file in front of him. He was reading the final pages of the Tennessee deal, something he'd spent nearly an entire year preparing, scheduled to sign in Nashville the following day. Alessandro was an alpha. Everyone knew it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and eyes so pale they looked almost silver in certain light. He moved through the world like a man who had never once been told no. There was a knock at the door. The man who entered had salt and pepper hair, and had come from Memphis wearing an expensive suit that had grown slightly too loose on his frame. He began speaking from the doorway, speaking quickly, speaking too much, in the way people do when they know they will only be given one chance to talk. He explained the last quarter, the market, several canceled contracts, and how everything would recover if he were only given a few more months. Alessandro didn't interrupt him once. He sat motionless with both hands resting on the table, the finger wearing a ring set with a black stone tapping once, and then going still. He allowed the other man to finish, allowed him to keep talking until his own voice finally ran dry, and the only sound left in the room was the air conditioning. Then Alessandro turned one page in the file, rotated it, and pushed it across the table. The man lowered his eyes. On the page was a list of money that had been transferred out of his company during the very quarter he'd just described as disastrous, transferred to a name only his wife knew. His face went white. Alessandro spoke in an even voice, no louder than someone asking what time it was. He said the money didn't bother him. He'd already granted 2 extensions without charging a single dollar of interest, and each time he'd known exactly why he was doing it. He said what troubled him wasn't the number on the page. What troubled him was sitting there for 15 minutes while a man who'd known him for 15 years assumed he didn't know. The man began to speak, his voice breaking, saying there had been a misunderstanding, saying he could explain. Alessandro raised one hand, lifting it only several inches above the tabletop, and the other man fell silent, as though someone had covered his mouth. Alessandro said that by Monday morning, his name would no longer appear on a single document at the port. There would be no letters, no lawsuit, no one calling him. He would simply no longer be there, and the people he usually had lunch with wouldn't answer when he called. And in about a week, he would understand. The man braced both hands against the edge of the table and asked what about the house. His voice reduced to little more than breath. Alessandro looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "You keep the house. I know your daughter is in her final year. I know she's preparing for her exams. And I don't destroy a child for her father's mistake. That's my rule, not kindness. And don't confuse the two." Then he added one final sentence in that same calm voice, saying that if anyone asked why he'd lost everything, tell them the truth. Because Alessandro would tell the truth, and he wanted the man's daughter to hear the story exactly as it happened, not some version he invented so he could still look her in the eyes. The man stood. He tried to say thank you, but no sound came out. And when he reached for his briefcase, his entire hand shook so badly that it took him 2 attempts to grasp the handle. The door closed behind him. Alessandro pulled the file back into place and found the exact line he'd been reading before the interruption, as though the last 15 minutes had never happened. A little while later, someone carried in a tray of light food, placed it beside his elbow, and invited him to eat before boarding the plane. Alessandro glanced at it once. "Please take that away. It contains sesame. I can't eat it. And my medical records state that clearly." The attendant apologized repeatedly and carried the tray out. Alessandro didn't look up. He turned to the next page, and beyond the glass, one airplane after another lifted from the runway into the morning sunlight. Around the middle of the flight, when the cabin lights had been dimmed and most of the plane had slipped into that hazy state between sleep and waking, Oliver drifted off with his cheek pressed against the window. Julian sat motionless beside his son, his eyes closed while his mind was 3 states away in a hospice hallway. He heard it before he understood what it was. A sound coming from the front of the cabin. Not a cough, not people arguing, but a thin, wet wheeze. The sound air makes when it has to force itself through an opening that is slowly closing. There are sounds the body recognizes before the mind does. And that sound traveled through 4 years of silence, reached something buried very deep inside Julian, and shook it awake. He opened his eyes. There were running footsteps, someone calling for a flight attendant. That particular sound a crowd makes when everyone knows something is going wrong, but no one wants to be the person who says it aloud. Julian was already on his feet before he realized he'd stood up. He leaned toward the flight attendant nearby and said quietly that his little boy was asleep. Could she please keep an eye on him for a moment? Then he stepped into the aisle. People were crowding together, rising out of their seats, craning their necks, holding up phones. Julian had to work his way past them one by one. The curtains separating the front cabin had been pulled aside. There, slumped across 2 leather seats, was the man in the charcoal suit Julian had briefly noticed while boarding. His collar was pulled open, both hands clawing at his throat, his face changing color in a way Julian had seen too many times ever to forget. 2 broad-shouldered men blocked the entrance. One held out an arm to stop Julian and told him to step back. "If you aren't involved, stay out of the way." Julian said, "I'm an emergency medical technician. Let me through." The old profession came out of his mouth dry and rusted, a name he hadn't been allowed to call himself for 4 years. The 2 men didn't move. They weren't listening to him. They were waiting for an order. And at that exact moment, the man dying in the seat lifted one hand several inches from the armrest, raised 2 fingers, and gave the smallest motion to the side. The 2 men immediately stepped back. Julian froze for half a breath. He watched that hand fall toward the seat again and understood that this man, even with his lungs barely taking in any air, was still giving orders. And he understood at the same time that he was stepping into a world he probably should have stayed far away from. He knelt anyway. One of the 2 men was already holding a second emergency injector, the needle aimed toward his employer's thigh. Julian caught his wrist. "How long ago did you give him the first one?" The man stammered that it had been almost 2 minutes. Julian said, "Then that's long enough that we should have seen some response, and there hasn't been any. Which means the problem isn't the dose. And if you put another one into him, the next thing we'll be treating is his heart instead of his airway. The man released his grip. Julian turned toward the flight attendant clutching the medical kit in both trembling hands, and he spoke in a voice he hadn't heard from himself in years. A voice so calm that it seemed to create order around it. Open the kit. Empty everything onto the seat. Then pick up each vial and read the label out loud to me. Every word. Don't skip anything. The flight attendant obeyed. The names came one after another through a cabin that had gone completely silent. And when she reached the fourth one, Julian said, "Stop. Give me that one and a syringe." He held the small glass vial in his hand, and for one brief moment, he thought about the stamped piece of paper saying these hands were no longer permitted to touch a patient. Then he pushed the thought away. He snapped the neck of the vial, inserted the needle, drew up the medication, turned the syringe upright, flicked it twice to bring the air bubbles to the top, and pushed them out. He leaned close to the man's face, laid his open palm against his cheek, and said, "Look at me. You have 10 seconds. Give me those 10 seconds." His eyelids, already beginning to roll upward, stopped, lowered again, found Julian's eyes, and held there. Julian pulled the fabric of the man's trousers aside, found the right place, drove the needle into the outer part of his thigh, pressed the plunger down slowly and steadily, held it there, then withdrew it. Then came the hardest part in the world. He placed 2 fingers against the man's neck and waited, counting silently inside his head, never taking his eyes off his for a single second, until the chest beneath that suit jerked upward and the man tore his first breath back into his lungs. The second breath came more easily than the first, and by the third, it was almost a normal breath. Color began returning to the man's face the way daylight slowly returns after a long night. Someone behind them started clapping. Then someone else joined in. Then the entire cabin broke into a long wave of applause that Julian didn't hear, because he still had 2 fingers pressed against the pulse in the man's neck, and he was still counting. That was when the man's hand found his wrist and closed around it. The grip was weak, but it didn't let go. He tried to speak, and it took him 2 attempts before any sound came out. Only 2 words. "Your name." Julian looked down at the hand holding him. He saw the black stone ring on the man's ring finger, the kind of thing a man usually didn't wear if it was only jewelry. He looked up and saw 3 men in dark suits quietly forming a circle around the place where he knelt. No one touching him, no one speaking, but standing in the way of men trained to make sure no one came in and no one went out. One of them was speaking into a satellite phone in a very low voice. Julian understood, later than he should have, exactly who he'd just saved. He eased his wrist out of the man's hand slowly, without pulling away. He told him to listen to this before he rested, that a reaction like this could come back a second time several hours later, and the second reaction was often worse than the first. So the moment they reached the ground, he needed to go straight to a hospital, not a hotel. He told him to make sure they knew he'd already been given an injection, where it had been given, and what time. Then he told him the exact time. Then Julian stood. There was only one thought in his mind, and it was colder than everything happening around him. If Alessandro stopped breathing after his hands had touched him, then everything people had said about Julian for the past 4 years would no longer be rumor. It would become true, and he wouldn't survive it a second time. The captain announced that the plane was diverting for an emergency landing, and by the time the wheels touched the runway in Little Rock, night had already fallen. All passengers were told to remain seated while medical personnel boarded first. Julian didn't remain seated. He'd already unfastened Oliver's seatbelt, already slung the cloth bag over his shoulder. The moment the door opened, he was the first person out, carrying his son against his chest, walking straight ahead, without looking back even once. At the rental car counter inside the terminal, they told him there was only 1 car left, and the price was more than an entire week's wages. Julian pushed his credit card across the counter, prayed it would go through one more time, and it did. That night, he drove across 2 states with his son asleep in the back seat. The radio turned low, both hands on the steering wheel, and his eyes fixed on the lane markings, heading toward a hospice hallway where someone was waiting for him. His phone remained in airplane mode because the battery was only half full, and he needed it for the final stretch of the drive. That same night, not far away, inside a bright white emergency room, Alessandro Ricci pushed the oxygen mask away from his face despite the doctor's objections. The first person he called wasn't family, wasn't the board, but Marco Fenwick. In a voice scraped raw and hoarse, he told Marco there had been a man on that flight. Dark hair tied back, gray sweater, traveling with a little boy, and he wanted him found. Marco asked how Alessandro intended to thank him. Alessandro was silent for a while before saying he didn't know. All he knew was that there had been 200 people inside that airplane and dozens of phones held up in the air, and the only person who stepped forward was someone who owed him nothing, didn't know who he was, and had nothing left to lose. I pay hundreds of people to keep me alive, Alessandro said, and not one of them managed to do what he did for free. I want to know why. Find him, whatever it costs. By sunrise, a video recorded from a row behind them had spread everywhere. People were calling Julian the man in the gray sweater, and the entire country had begun searching for a name no one knew. The sky over Nashville still hadn't begun to brighten when Julian pushed open the door to the last room at the end of the hallway and saw Ruth Vandermeer lying there, diminished until Julian almost didn't recognize the man who had driven a school bus for most of his life and had once taken Julian and his son into his home during the hardest years they had ever known. But Ruth's eyes opened when the door moved, and they found Julian immediately. They lit up in exactly the same way they used to when Julian was a 12-year-old boy stepping down from the school bus. Ruth said, "My boy came home." Julian walked to the bed, took that hand in his, and the knot that had been locked inside his chest for the past 2 days finally began to loosen. Oliver climbed onto the edge of the bed, kissed Ruth on the forehead, and proudly told him that he'd gotten to sit by the window and had seen the clouds from above. Ruth smiled and told him, "Then you've done better than I ever did. I went my whole life without seeing the clouds from above." Then Ruth told Julian, "Take the little one outside for a while, sweetheart. I want to talk to his father." A nurse led Oliver into the hallway and promised to show him where they kept the stuffed animals in the waiting room. The door closed behind them. Ruth said he'd heard the nurses talking since the night before. Something happened on the airplane, didn't it? Julian started to say it was nothing, but Ruth tightened his fingers around Julian's hand, and Julian told him. He told him everything. About the wheezing sound coming from the front of the cabin, about the 2 men blocking the aisle, about the little glass vial in his hand, about the 10 seconds he'd asked for and the 10 seconds he'd been given. Ruth listened without blinking. When Julian finished, he lay quietly for a while, then said, "Listen to me. I'm only saying this once because I don't have enough strength to say it twice." He said they had taken Julian's license, taken his name, and put it in the newspapers, forced him to spend years cleaning floors at night. But the man who had just knelt down in that airplane aisle, they hadn't taken him. Do you understand? That man was still whole. Ruth said he'd waited 4 years to hear that Julian was still there. Now don't let them take the rest of you too. Julian bent down, pressed his forehead against the back of Ruth's hand, and promised, though he had no idea how he was going to keep that promise. Ruth released one long breath, and his face softened, and the lines carved there by a difficult lifetime seemed to ease before Julian's eyes. He said he was tired now and wanted to rest for a little while. He passed away as morning came, as quietly as someone falling asleep after a very long day. Julian remained beside him for a long time, still holding his hand, until he felt the exact moment that hand stopped holding his back. Out in the hallway, Julian knelt until he was level with his son and said, "Grandma is resting now, sweetheart. He isn't tired anymore." Oliver asked whether Grandma had heard his story about the clouds. Julian said, he did. It was the last story he heard, and he loved it. For people came to the funeral. The man who had opened his home to nearly 20 children no one else wanted had 4 people standing there when he was laid to rest. Julian stood in that cold morning and understood something he would carry for the rest of his life, that the system used good people until they were worn down, then forgot their names. Oliver placed a small bouquet of flowers down, stepped back, and waved goodbye to Ruth with the same little wave he used at the school gate every morning after everyone else had gone. Julian sat on a stone bench beside the path and turned on his phone for the first time in 3 days. The screen kept vibrating for nearly a full minute. There were hundreds of missed calls from numbers he'd never seen before, messages from newsrooms, from strangers, from people claiming to represent someone. He moved through all of them with a numbness he could barely feel until he stopped at an email written by someone named Marco Fenwick. The message was short and polite, and it carried 2 pieces of news. The first was that Mr. Ricci wanted to meet Julian wherever he chose, whenever he wanted, under whatever conditions he set, and that he had no intention of disturbing him if he refused. The second came in the final paragraph, and the writer said he was sincerely sorry to be the person delivering it. The airline had filed an incident report. The licensing board had reopened Julian's case. And this time, they weren't considering extending his suspension. This time, they were considering permanent revocation. Julian chose a modest diner on 12th Street, the kind of place with cracked vinyl seats and coffee that had been sitting on the burner a little too long. He chose it because he wanted this meeting to happen somewhere he understood the rules. The black car pulled up outside close to noon. When 2 broad-shouldered men entered first and took positions on either side of the door, the whole diner went silent, as though someone had pulled the plug from the wall. The waiter froze in the middle of the aisle with a coffee pot in his hand and didn't dare take another step. Alessandro Ricci came in last. He sat down across from Julian, and before he could say a word, Julian spoke. "Send those 2 men outside. My son is eating, and I don't want the child having breakfast beneath 2 shadows." Alessandro looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then he made one small motion with his hand, and the 2 men went outside. The waiter let out a breath, and conversation slowly returned to the diner. When Julian went back to cutting his piece of cake as though nothing had happened, Alessandro said he hadn't come to thank him because those words were too small for what he owed. And he hadn't come to ask why Julian had walked away either, because that belonged to him. He said he'd come because there was one thing he hadn't told anyone. He said that when he was lying across those airplane seats and knew he had only a few seconds left, he hadn't thought about his company, hadn't thought about the port, hadn't thought about a single number. He'd thought about his own funeral. "There will be a great many people there," Alessandro said. "People will wear dark clothes and stand in lines and say beautiful things about me." He stopped. "And not one of them will really cry." That was the thought I was ready to take with me, until a stranger placed his hand against my face and made me look into his eyes. Julian said nothing. Alessandro reached into his coat, and Julian had already prepared himself for a check, already prepared his answer. But what he placed on the table wasn't a check. It was a thin file. Julian opened it and found the complete record of his old case, including pages he'd never been allowed to see. Clipped to the top was the name of a certification restoration program for people who had left the profession and wanted to return. Alessandro said he'd looked into it. He knew he couldn't buy Julian's dignity back for him. No one could buy that for another person. He said Julian would have to go and reclaim it himself, one step at a time. It would be very difficult, and there was a chance he wouldn't get it back at all. The only thing Alessandro could do was open the door. Whether he walked through it was up to him. Julian looked at the file for a long time. Then he said, "If I accept this, I have 3 conditions. And if you don't agree to all 3, I get up and walk out right now." The first condition was that not $1 of Alessandro's money would touch Oliver's surgery. Julian would pay for that himself, even if it took longer. The second was that no one would arrange anything for him behind the scenes. If he took the exam, he would take it for real. If he failed, he would fail for real. He didn't want to reach the end of his life still wondering whether he deserved what he had. Then Julian stopped and looked directly into Alessandro's eyes. The third condition was that if anyone ever stood in his way and something happened to them afterward, if he heard even once that Alessandro had used his own methods to clear the road for him, Julian would take his son and leave, and Alessandro would never find either of them again. Alessandro was silent. He remained silent much longer than those first 3 seconds, long enough for Julian to hear plates touching one another behind the kitchen counter. In that silence, something old and very heavy seemed to be weighing itself behind Alessandro's eyes. Then he said, "Agreed." All three. Oliver, who had been quietly eating until then, suddenly placed his small hand over the back of Alessandro's, the hand wearing the black stone ring, and said, "Don't be sad anymore. Grandma Ruth said when your heart is sad, you have to find something to do. He said that's why he grew tomatoes." Alessandro looked down at that tiny hand, and a man no one had dared interrupt for many years sat quietly and listened to the advice of a 4-year-old child. Then he said, "Thank you. I'll find something to do." Oliver had finished eating and was busy coloring on the paper liner beneath his tray when Julian took out his phone. He opened a photograph and turned the screen toward Alessandro. "Look at this." It was a picture of the casing from the emergency injector one of Alessandro's men had used on him aboard the plane, the one that hadn't worked at all. Julian had picked it up from the cabin floor before walking out the door without even understanding why he'd done it. He enlarged the faint line of printing along the edge of the casing. "I need you to understand something. That medication didn't fail because it was old, and it didn't fail because of temperature. That injector had been diluted. Someone removed part of what was inside, replaced it with something that wasn't medication, then sealed it again and sold it as untouched product." Alessandro looked at the photograph without speaking. Julian continued, and now his voice was different, lower and slower, like someone descending a staircase he'd spent years refusing to walk down. "I know that line of printing because I've seen it once before, the night of March 14th. For years ago. At the time, Julian was still an emergency medical technician with an air rescue crew. They picked up a 22-year-old man suffering anaphylactic shock on the highway. Inside the helicopter, Julian followed every step exactly, so precisely that when people later reviewed the report, they couldn't find a single procedural mistake. He gave the first injection. Nothing happened. He gave the second. Still nothing. The young man died before they landed. People said Julian had injected him in the wrong place. Said he'd been too slow. Said he'd panicked. Julian said there had been something wrong with the medication. No one believed him. The newspapers gave him a name he still couldn't bring himself to read again. Within 6 months, he lost his license, lost his profession, and lost even the right to call himself by the name of the work he'd once done. He set the phone on the table. "You see it now. The same medication. For years apart. Once it almost killed you. Once it killed that young man. And it killed my life with him." Alessandro sat very still. Then he asked a question Julian hadn't expected. "Did you know I had a signing scheduled in Nashville on the 15th? Julian said no. Alessandro said he was beginning to see something, and it wasn't pleasant. Someone didn't want that signing to happen, because once he acquired that distribution company, all 4 years of its records would be opened and examined line by line. Whoever did this hadn't intended to kill him. Killing him would create chaos, trigger investigations, throw the entire organization into turmoil. They only needed him in a hospital for a few days, long enough to delay the signing. And an allergic reaction to food would look exactly like an accident. Changing one line in my medical file would be easy. All it takes is one person inside the system and one afternoon." Julian asked, "Then what about the injector?" Alessandro smiled, but it wasn't a smile. That was the part the man hadn't calculated. He had no idea what was inside the emergency kit on that airplane. The product he's been selling for years traveled so far that it ended up right inside my own security team's emergency kit. He meant to make me sick for a few days. Then his own merchandise came back and nearly killed me. He said it very quietly, and in the middle of that noisy diner, Julian felt a chill move along his spine. Alessandro took out his phone and dialed a number. When the person on the other end answered, his voice changed completely. Nothing remained of the man who had just sat listening to advice from a little boy. "Marco, I want every pharmaceutical distribution contract connected to the family from the last 4 years. Every one of them. Include the ones that were terminated. He listened for a moment, then said, "No, not through the office." Then he added one final sentence, speaking slowly. "And Silvio is not to know anything." The family meeting took place Thursday night in the long dining room where Alessandro's father had sat for 20 years in the exact chair that now belonged to him. When Alessandro walked in, 9 people were already seated. 9 faces he'd known since before he was tall enough to see over the edge of the table. He announced briefly that the last branch of the business that had never been made legitimate would be cut away during this quarter, and that after that, the Ricci family would keep only the things that could be brought into the light without anyone having to lower their eyes. No one said anything. Then Silvio pushed back his chair and stood. He asked whether Alessandro knew where this table came from. Their grandfather had slept in a warehouse through 3 winters, sleeping on sacks, saving every dollar he could. When he finally bought this house, the first thing he did was build this table with his own hands because he wanted his children and grandchildren to have a proper place to sit and eat. Alessandro's father sat in the exact chair you're sitting in now, and he died before 60. Died because of this table. Because of the sleepless nights. Because of all the things he'd swallowed so everyone in this family could have food on their plates. And now you intend to sell all of that just to buy yourself one word, clean. Silvio never raised his voice, and that was what made the words so heavy. You think people are going to applaud you? They'll wait until you've put everything down, and then they'll walk right in. He looked around the table. 30 families lived because of this house. 30 kitchens had food cooking because of this house. And you're cutting away one branch after another while no one dares ask what those people are supposed to live on afterward. Several people nodded. None of them nodded strongly, but they nodded. And Alessandro saw everyone. He remained silent until Silvio sat down. Then he didn't argue a single point. He opened his briefcase, took out 3 photographs, and placed them on the table, sliding each one in a different direction. The room went still. He called 3 names, one at a time, without raising his voice or placing emphasis on a single word. The 3 of them had been taking money from a side he expressly forbade them to deal with, and they'd been taking it for the entire past year. And they'd sat at this table eating with him while they were doing it. None of the 3 men looked up. Alessandro said tomorrow morning, "Go see Marco and sign your resignation papers." Then he said the rest, and he said it slowly. You keep your houses. You keep your pensions. You keep your names. No one in this city will ever know what happened. And your children will keep going to school as if nothing changed. He stopped. My father wouldn't have allowed that. And every one of you knows exactly what he would have done. That is the entire difference between him and me. And I strongly suggest none of you try to find out how deep that difference goes. He stood before anyone could speak, gathered the 3 photographs, and said the cuts would proceed on schedule. Anyone who disagreed could come speak to him directly. Stop talking behind each other's backs. This family has done enough of that. When he reached the door, Silvio called after him in an almost familiar voice. You're standing alone now, Alessandro. Look at the table yourself and count how many people are still standing with you. Alessandro stopped with one hand on the doorknob. He didn't turn around. I already counted. Then he walked out. That night, Alessandro went home, took off his coat, sat down on the floor of his study beside the 2 boxes of records, and started reading from the first page. He read until close to dawn, and at some point, among the steady stream of distribution contracts and familiar signatures, he stopped at the name of a company he'd never heard of before. A company registered somewhere far away, appearing again and again like a thread running through 4 years of paperwork. He picked up a pen and circled it. Then he sat there for a very long time, staring at that ring of ink, and he knew that what he was holding in his hands was no longer about business. On Julian's first morning at the training center, he sat in his car in the parking lot longer than he'd intended, watching people pass beyond the windshield, most of them younger than he was. All of them looking as though they knew exactly where they were going. He nearly put the car into reverse. In the end, he went inside. The man in charge was an older instructor named Walt Kimura, with gray hair and a rough voice. He began by saying that most of the people sitting in this room wouldn't make it all the way through this program. Not because they weren't smart enough, but because coming back was harder than starting. People who are new don't know what they're missing. You know exactly what you've lost, and that empty place will eat at you a little more every day. The first simulation took place that same morning, and Walt called Julian up first. He walked to the wired mannequin, and for the first 30 seconds, everything was right. His hands knew where to go without needing him to think. Then he named a medication and stated the dose, and a very young trainee in the back row quietly said, "They changed that, sir. 2 years ago." The whole room went silent. Julian stood there with the wrong syringe in his hand, his face burning. For one brief moment, he was back inside a meeting 4 years earlier where people had taken turns saying he wasn't capable enough to do the work. He opened his mouth to apologize. Walt cut him off. "Don't apologize. Correct it. What's the current protocol?" Julian straightened and said, "I don't know." He said it clearly, without trying to hide behind anything, without blaming the 4 years he'd been away. "I don't know the current protocol." Walt nodded, and what he did next caught Julian completely off guard. He smiled. "Good. That's the sentence I was hoping more than anything to hear in this room this morning." He turned toward the class and said, "Do you know how many people die every year because somewhere in the room there's one person who doesn't have the courage to say those 3 words? I don't know? I'm not giving you a number. Go work long enough, and you'll find out for yourselves." He said the empty space he'd talked about earlier wasn't a weakness. It was a place where new knowledge could go, and the person who could identify the gaps in what they knew was the person who could fill them. Then he turned toward the young trainee and said, "Thank you. You just taught someone with 10 more years of experience than you. Go home and write down today's date." In the weeks that followed, Julian lived according to a rhythm he didn't know how long he could sustain. He studied late into the night at the kitchen table after Oliver had gone to sleep, studied until the words on the page began to blur, then woke before dawn to make breakfast for his son and braid the hair he still never seemed to braid quite right. One evening, after a particularly terrible day, he sat looking at the business card Alessandro had left him, the one with nothing but a handwritten number on the back. And he called. He didn't call because he needed anything. He called just to see whether anyone would answer. Alessandro picked up on the second ring. Julian said, "I embarrassed myself in front of the entire class. A kid who isn't even as old as my younger brother had to correct me." Alessandro asked whether he'd learned the right protocol. Julian said yes. "Then that kid just made you better than the man you were this morning. And someday, someone may stay alive because of it. Don't call that embarrassment." Then Alessandro asked how Oliver was doing and whether he'd gotten used to his new school. After that, it became a habit. Every week, Alessandro asked. And what surprised Julian wasn't that he asked, but that he remembered. He remembered the name of Oliver's teacher. He remembered that Oliver was afraid of the neighbor's dogs. Once, Oliver snatched the phone from his father's hand to announce that his stuffed bear, Pepper, had torn an arm and Daddy had sewn it back on. And the following week, the first thing Alessandro asked when Julian answered was whether Pepper's arm had healed. Julian stood in the kitchen holding the phone, staring out into the darkness beyond the window, and realized that the man an entire city only dared speak about in whispers was carrying the name of a cloth bear somewhere inside his memory. And he had no idea what to do with that thought. One Friday afternoon, after everyone else in the class had gone home and Julian was putting away his things in the practice room, Walt Kimura stood in the doorway and asked whether he could sit down for a moment. There was something he needed to tell Julian, something he'd been meaning to say since the first day Julian walked through that door. He pulled a chair over and sat across from Julian, both hands resting on his thighs. And he didn't look at him. He asked whether Julian had ever wondered who signed the report that caused his license to be taken away. Julian said the name had been blacked out in the copy he was given. Walt nodded very slowly. "It was me." The air conditioner hummed steadily in the room, and somewhere outside someone was pulling down a metal shutter. Julian sat there listening to those sounds while his entire world seemed to turn once around him. Walt said his son was the warehouse manager for a small contractor. That night, he was the one who signed for the shipment. He signed without opening it to inspect anything, because he'd been signing deliveries that way for 2 years and nothing had ever gone wrong. When everything fell apart, people came to see Walt. They told him there were 2 ways this could end. The first was to trace the failure back through the warehouse, and if they did that, his son would have to stand trial under a charge he'd carry for the rest of his life. The second was for the official report to conclude that the medical worker aboard the helicopter had performed the procedure incorrectly, and they needed the signature of someone with standing in the profession to make that conclusion hold. I was that person, Walt said. I was also the one who recommended you for the flight team when you were 23. You remember that, don't you? I sat on that board and told them you were the person I trusted most in your class. His voice broke in the middle of the sentence. I sat in my car for almost 2 hours before I signed it. I kept telling myself you were young, barely into your 20s, that you'd find another job, get married, build another life. While my son would never be able to stand again if they stamped that mark onto his name. I told myself that so many times that eventually I believed it. Then I signed. For the first time, he looked up at Julian. Recently, I was taking an overnight bus to visit my sister. The bus stopped at the station close to 3 in the morning, and I was sitting on a bench in the waiting area when I saw a man pushing a cleaning cart past me. I recognized you immediately. You never saw me. I sat there and watched you clean that entire terminal, then watched you push the cart away until you disappeared. And I understood that what I'd told myself in that car years earlier had been a lie, and I'd lived inside that lie for 4 years. He said he'd thought about quitting, then realized that if he walked away, it still wouldn't give Julian anything back. So he stayed and taught. He kept teaching, and every time someone walks into this classroom trying to begin again, he thinks of Julian. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Walt said. I only wanted you to know the truth, because you have the right to know it. And because I didn't want you to finish this entire program only to hear it later from someone else's mouth. Julian sat in silence for a very long time. He thought of a man lying in a hospital bed telling him not to let them take the rest of him. He thought of his son sitting at daycare, waiting for his father to come pick him up. Then he spoke in a voice so calm that even he was surprised by it. You took 4 years from me, and I'm not going to tell you that was all right, because it wasn't. It mattered. It mattered more than you know. Then he said, but I'm raising a child by myself, and I have to work, and I have to study, and I have to get up before sunrise. There isn't enough room inside me to carry hatred for you and carry my son at the same time. If I have to choose, I choose my son. So I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I need that space for something else. Walt lowered his head and began to cry, the quiet kind of crying that comes from an old man who has carried something for far too long. Julian stood, rested one hand on Walt's shoulder for a moment, then picked up his bag and walked outside to get his son. The man leaning against the door of Julian's car in the training center parking lot that afternoon had eyes exactly like Alessandro's, only colder. He greeted Julian by name as though they'd known each other for years. I'm Silvio Ricci. I'm his cousin, and I didn't come here to threaten you, so don't look at me like that. He didn't reach inside his coat, didn't lower his voice, didn't step 1 inch closer. He only held out a thin packet of papers. Julian opened it and saw a foreclosure notice for Ruth's house in Nashville, followed by a statement of debt, the numbers he hadn't known existed, arranged in neat rows beneath the name he loved more than any other in the world. Silvio said, I didn't create those papers. Call the bank and ask. Anyone can verify them in 20 minutes. I only brought them to you sooner. He said he knew Julian's son was waiting for surgery, and he knew Julian was waiting for money. Then he said what he'd come to say. He asked what Julian was getting by staying here. You make my cousin feel better about himself. That's all. 6 months from now, when that sense of dead inside him cools down, you'll still be a man cleaning floors at night, with a child waiting for surgery and a house being taken by the bank. He asked whether Julian wanted to help his little boy or help Alessandro Ricci's conscience. Julian held the papers for a long time. He stood there in the parking lot with the wind moving between the rows of cars, reread the lines showing the date the bank would take possession of the house, and thought about the porch where Ruth used to sit shelling beans. Then he folded the papers, held them back towards Silvio, and said, "Keep them. I'll ask the bank myself." Silvio took them, nodded as though he'd expected that answer, and said, "Think about it. I'm in no hurry." Julian drove away with both hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. And he didn't go home. He drove straight to Alessandro's residence in Chicago, having relocated his training and Oliver's medical care to the city, because he needed to tell someone what had just happened, and because he realized with a small amount of fear that the person he needed to tell was him. The door opened. Alessandro led him into his study, and before Julian could speak, his eyes stopped on the desk. There was a typed sheet of paper lying there. Silvio's name was on the first line. Beneath it were his home address, his office address, the time he left home in the morning, the restaurant where he usually ate lunch, and the name of his driver. Julian looked at the paper, then at Alessandro. "You already knew?" Alessandro said, "Since noon." Julian asked, "Since noon means almost 6 hours ago. And you've been sitting here for 6 hours with that paper on your desk?" Alessandro said yes. Julian asked why he hadn't done anything. Alessandro looked at the page for a moment, then said, "Because in that diner, you made me promise." He said that all his life, every promise he'd ever kept had benefited him somehow. If you kept your word, people trusted you. If people trusted you, business got done. It was an investment, not morality. This is the first promise I've ever kept, where keeping it gives me nothing at all except 6 hours of sitting still and staring at a piece of paper. Then he said, "And I'll tell you the truth, I picked up the phone twice." Julian asked what stopped him. There was something else. There was a man in Memphis I once took everything from. I let him keep his house because his daughter was in her final year of school. My family has a rule, my rule, really, that we don't touch the families of our enemies. I've managed to keep that rule for decades because I've never truly cared about anyone. Now I do care. And if I call the number on this page, I'll be the first person to break my own rule. And the thing I drag you into will become exactly the thing you're trying to walk away from." Julian said, "I thought you'd be angry." Alessandro said, "I am angry, but you were right to make me promise. And I owe you my life. So I'm listening to you." Julian sat down in the chair across from him, and for the first time since he'd walked off that airplane, he felt his shoulders lower a little. He told Alessandro everything that had happened in the parking lot, including Silvio's final question, and Alessandro listened without interrupting once. When Julian left, Alessandro walked him all the way to the door. Then he went back inside, picked up the paper, read it one more time, and burned it in the stone ashtray on his desk, standing there until nothing remained but ash. Silvio sent it through the mail, a plain white envelope with no return name. It arrived in Julian's mailbox on a rainy afternoon. Inside was only one photocopied page and a small note with a few words written on it. "Ask him whose signature this is." The page was a distribution authorization, clearly listing the receiving company, clearly showing the date. And that date was March 14th. For years earlier. In the lower right corner, written in firm, unmistakable ink, was Alessandro Ricci's signature. Julian stood in the kitchen holding the paper and stopped hearing the rain. He drove through that afternoon storm and reached Alessandro's house after dark. When Alessandro opened the door, Julian didn't step inside. He stood in the yard with water running through his hair and held up the page. "Explain this to me." Alessandro looked at the paper in Julian's hand, and he didn't look surprised. And that lack of surprise told Julian everything he needed to know. "Come inside first. You're soaked," Julian said. "How long have you known?" Alessandro was silent for one beat. Then he said, 3 weeks. Julian heard himself laugh, a short, ugly sound he'd never heard come out of him before. 3 weeks. So you already knew before the day you called me to ask how my son was doing. You sat across from me in that diner. You pushed that file across the table. You told me you couldn't buy my dignity back for me. You looked straight into my eyes and said that. He said, "Do you know what I thought in that moment? I thought you were the first person in 4 years who looked at me without seeing the headline." Alessandro said, "I didn't know at the diner. I found out afterward." Julian said, "Then what were these past 3 weeks? 3 weeks of calling to ask about my son's stuffed bear. 3 weeks of listening to me talk about class. 3 weeks of sitting still with a piece of paper on your desk because you were keeping a promise to me and making me believe you were a different kind of man." He said, "What was all of that? Answer me." Then he said the sentence he would remember for the rest of his life. "I am not the machine you use to wash your conscience clean." Alessandro stood beneath the light of the doorway while rain blew across the steps. He didn't deny a single word. "Everything you said is true." Julian said, "I know it's true. I don't need you to confirm it." Alessandro said, "I signed that paper during the second week after my father died. There were hundreds of documents waiting for my signature, and I signed all of them in 3 days. I signed this one in the middle of the others. I didn't read it. I'm not telling you that as an excuse, because it doesn't excuse anything. I signed it. That night, what went on to your helicopter passed through a document carrying my signature. That is the truth, and it isn't going to change." Julian said, "Then why did you hide it from me?" Alessandro was silent longer than necessary. Then he said, "Because I know you. If I'd handed you this paper 3 weeks ago, you would have walked away that same night. You would have left the program, left the exam, left all of it. And you would have gone back to that bus terminal and cleaned floors at night until your back gave out." He said, "I didn't hide it because I was afraid you'd hate me. I knew sooner or later you'd find out, and I knew you'd hate me then. I hid it because I wanted you to have your license in your hands first. I'd rather have you hate me for the rest of your life than watch you lose one more night to that floor." Julian stood motionless in the rain. "You're doing exactly what you've done your whole life. You sit at the head of the table, decide what is good for me, hide the rest, and call it protection. You don't have the right to decide for me, even if you're right. For 4 years, people have taken everything from me. The only thing I had left was the right to know what was happening to my own life. And you just took that too." Alessandro said nothing after that. He couldn't find a single sentence to answer with, and he knew there wasn't one. Julian folded the paper, slipped it into his coat pocket, and turned toward his car. Alessandro called his name once. Julian didn't stop. He drove away through the rain. And for the next 3 weeks, he didn't answer Alessandro's calls, didn't respond to his messages. And Alessandro didn't call a second time. The letter from the bank arrived during the 3rd week. It said Julian had 10 days to remove everything from the house in Nashville. He read that line again and again without being able to understand it. Ruth had paid that house off a long time ago. He'd told the story many times, told it every Christmas in the voice of someone who had defeated something enormous in his life. How he'd made the final payment on a September morning and then stood in the middle of the yard and cried. So why was the house being taken now? Julian called the bank, and all they would say was that they were sorry, the account was under review, and he should come to the branch if he had questions. He arranged for Oliver to stay at daycare for 2 days, booked a quick flight to Nashville, and opened the door to that house for the first time since the funeral. Everything inside was still exactly as it had been on the day Ruth went to the hospice. There was a cup turned upside down on the dish rack. There was a calendar page that had never been torn away. Julian started in the living room, putting the things he would keep into boxes and the things he would give away into bags, working mechanically so he wouldn't have to think. By afternoon, he reached the bedroom. He pulled several shoe boxes from beneath the bed. Then his hand touched something heavier, a square holiday cookie tin with rust along 2 corners. He pulled it out and lifted the lid. Inside were letters. An entire box filled with letters. The envelopes were standing upright, packed tightly together, and every one carried a red stamp saying it had been returned to sender. Julian picked up the one on top, turned it over, and read the address written in the slanted handwriting he'd seen on hundreds of birthday cards throughout his life. To the Arizona Emergency Medical Licensing Board. He sank down onto the floor. He took them all out, arranged them in stacks across the rug, and counted. 142 letters. That old man had written 3 letters every month, steadily, for 4 years to an agency where he didn't know a single person, about a process he didn't understand, using an old typewriter in the corner of the living room and stamps he bought at the post office down the street. And not one letter had ever been opened. They stamped them and sent them back one after another, year after year. And still he kept writing. Julian opened the first letter, dated 4 years earlier. Only a few weeks after the newspapers had given him the name, he still couldn't bring himself to read again. In it, Ruth introduced himself as a retired school bus driver and wrote that he didn't understand their rules, but he understood this boy, and he was asking them to please read the file one more time. Julian opened the next letter, then the next. The handwriting leaned farther with each passing year, the strokes becoming shakier, but the words remained the same, still polite, still patient, still asking them to please look at the file one more time. He read until he reached the final letter, then looked at the date and realized Ruth had written it only a few weeks before entering the hospice. The writing was larger and more uneven, done by hand instead of on the typewriter, perhaps because by then he could no longer sit upright for very long. Ruth wrote that this was his 142nd letter. He wrote that he imagined they wouldn't open this one either, and he didn't blame them. They were probably very busy. He wrote that, but if someday someone did open it, please know one thing. That boy has never ruined anything in his life. He simply never had anyone standing on his side. I have stood on his side ever since the day he was 12 years old and stepped down from my school bus. The trouble is that I don't have any power, ladies and gentlemen. All I have is paper and stamps. Julian sat on the floor among those letters until the house had gone completely dark, and he never turned on a light. He cried the way people cry when there is no one else left in the house to be careful around. Cried for an old man sitting at a typewriter in an empty living room 3 times every month for 4 years. Cried because through all that endless time, Julian had believed he was completely alone. It was late before he finally began placing the letters back inside the tin. And when he reached the bottom layer, he found another envelope, thicker than the others, bearing the markings of a bank. He picked it up, turned it over in his hands, assumed it was some old bill Ruth had saved out of habit, and placed it back inside the box without opening it. Then he closed the lid, carried the tin out to his rental car, and sat behind the steering wheel for a very long time without moving. 2 days later, after flying back, Julian arrived at the training center before Walt Kimura. Marco Fenwick called Julian on a Tuesday evening and said, "I know you don't want to hear anything from our side right now, but there's something I think you need to be the first person to see." He said they'd found the original warehouse intake log from that night, the handwritten book rather than the computerized record, and there was a receiving signature in it. Julian asked whose signature. Marco was silent for half a second, then said, "I think you should see it for yourself." He sent a photograph of the page to Julian's phone, and Julian opened it beneath the kitchen light. And there, in the final column, written in the right-leaning handwriting he'd looked at for 6 years on notes stuck to the refrigerator, were 2 words. Caleb Hollis. Julian placed the phone on the table. For the next 2 minutes, he sat motionless in his kitchen while his entire world tilted sideways. His husband. The alpha he'd buried while he was pregnant with the child they hadn't even had time to name together. He had signed for that shipment. He'd been there. Somewhere inside that chain, his hands were in it. Julian thought about the nights Caleb had come home late, the phone calls he'd stepped onto the porch to take. And in those 2 brief minutes, he began building a story he didn't want to build. Then Marco called again. "Are you still there?" "I wasn't finished." He asked whether Julian knew what his husband had been responsible for at the station besides being a firefighter. Julian said Caleb inspected equipment. Marco said exactly. He was responsible for inspecting and rotating the station's medical equipment. And that night, he signed for the shipment because that was his job. He signed for the entire station. Then he said there was something else, and this part, he thought Julian should sit down for. He said that in the same logbook, 3 weeks before that night, there was a note written into the margin in the same handwriting. and he was going to read it exactly as it appeared. He read slowly. This batch seems more diluted than usual. Looks different from previous shipments. Separated 2 boxes. Need to send samples for testing before use. We'll follow up with contractor on Monday. Julian couldn't speak. Marco said he saw it. 3 weeks before everything happened. He held that product in his hands, knew something wasn't right, and wrote it down. He said they'd checked, and no samples were ever sent. Then he stopped, and neither man had to say the thing lying between them. That Monday never came, because the spring fire that year happened first. Julian remained sitting for a long time after the call ended. Then he stood, went into the storage room, and pulled down a dust-covered cardboard box from the top of the closet. It was the box of personal belongings the fire station had returned to him 4 years earlier. The box he'd accepted with both hands at the door, carried straight to the top shelf, and never once found the courage to open. He sat down on the floor and lifted the lid. Inside was a wristwatch, a badge, several photographs, a pair of gloves. And at the bottom, lying flat, was a hard-covered notebook with curled edges. Julian turned the pages one by one. Work notes, dates, times, numbers. The hurried handwriting of a man recording things while he worked. Then he reached that exact page. The note in the margin, written in blue ink, smaller than everything around it, as though Caleb had written it for himself so he wouldn't forget. Julian read it with his own eyes, not through someone else's voice. He pressed the notebook against his chest and sat on the floor among his husband's belongings. And he cried in a way completely different from the night in Nashville. That night, he'd cried because someone had stood on his side. Tonight, he cried because for 4 years he'd stood alone in front of everyone and said there was something wrong with the medication, and not one person had believed him. And it turned out there had been someone who believed it. Someone who believed it before Julian ever needed him to. Only he hadn't lived long enough to tell anyone. Julian stayed there until nearly morning, one hand resting on the page bearing Caleb's handwriting, and whispered into the empty room, "You found it. You found it before I did." The next morning, he wrapped the notebook inside a paper bag, picked up his phone, and for the first time in 3 weeks, dialed the handwritten number on the back of the business card. The call reached Alessandro close to 4 o'clock in the morning. The man bringing the news was an old driver at the port, a man who had driven for Alessandro's father since before Alessandro could walk. "Sir, they called the whole crew into Warehouse 3. They told us to clear it out tonight, load all the records onto the trucks. Something about this doesn't feel right, so I called you." Alessandro said, "Thank you. Stay exactly where you are. Don't do anything." He called Marco on the way to the port and said only one thing. "Warehouse 3, right now." Then he ended the call. When his car stopped at gate number 4, 3 trucks were already running inside, all their headlights on, white beams cutting across the concrete yard, while people loaded boxes of records into the back of the last truck. The man with Alessandro opened his door, stepped out, and instinctively reached inside his coat. Alessandro caught his wrist. "Put your hand down." The man said, "But sir, there are cameras here. And tonight, I need that footage clean from beginning to end. Clean enough that they can play it in court, and I can sit there without moving. Do you understand me?" The man lowered his hand. Then Alessandro took off his coat, handed it to him, and walked into the yard alone, both hands empty, straight into the glare of the headlights. He stopped directly in front of the first truck. The engine growled and kept running. He didn't shout. He only raised his voice enough to carry over the motors. "I'm not going inside that warehouse, and no one else is going inside either. Everything stays exactly where it is. I'm only standing here. Anything that wants to leave through this gate has to go through me." The driver in the cab remained still, both hands resting on the steering wheel, his face washed pale by the dashboard lights. Alessandro said, "I know you men. Mr. Ellis drove for my father when I was still in school. Mr. Ferrara has hauled freight for this family for 30 years. And I know you're waiting for me to give an order because you've spent your whole lives working here, and your job has always been to wait for someone to tell you what to do." He paused. Then he said, Tonight I'm asking you to do something I've never asked anyone in this family to do. Don't follow orders. Don't even follow mine. Think for yourselves. What's inside those boxes is the paper trail for diluted emergency medication product that has been sold all over the country for years. And it has ended up inside medical kits in places none of you would ever imagine. He said, Mr. Ferrara, your granddaughter has asthma. You told me about it last year. If one night she has an attack at school and someone runs for the emergency kit, what do you want to be inside that box? No one spoke. There was only the sound of 3 engines idling. Then the first truck shut off. Part of the roar disappeared, and inside the silence that opened around it, the second truck shut down too. Then the third. The headlights went dark one by one, and the yard returned to the weak yellow glow of the overhead lamps while the men climbed out of their trucks and stood beside them. No one went anywhere. Federal vehicles entered through gate number 4 exactly 10 minutes later, and they moved quickly, cleanly, with the precision of people who already knew which direction to take inside this port. Alessandro watched them seal the warehouse doors, then turned toward Marco Fenwick, who had just come to stand beside him. I called exactly one person tonight, Alessandro said. He didn't answer. He said, and those boxes of records you brought me after one night. I remember thinking that was too fast. I let it go. Marco kept his eyes on the yard. I've been here for more than a year. I was sent here to wait for you to make a mistake. And I've waited for more than 12 months, and you haven't made one. You just keep cutting things away, then cutting again. He said, I reported upstairs that you were the first man in 30 years who was trying to walk out of this through the front door. And no one believed me. Then he turned toward Alessandro. Now you have 2 roads. The first is that you stay silent. Your lawyer is good. That signature is one signature among hundreds of documents. You can get out from under it. But if you choose that road, then everything in this warehouse becomes evidence in an active investigation. It gets sealed, and no one is allowed to touch it for years. Which means Mr. Hollis will never be able to prove what he's been saying. His license will be taken permanently. He said, the second road is that you testify. You tell them everything. You open all of it. And he gets his name back. Then he said the rest, very quietly. And you go to prison. The call from the hospital came the afternoon before the hearing was scheduled to begin. The doctor spoke in the gentle voice Julian had learned to recognize, saying that lately the little boy had been tiring more quickly than usual, that this week's test results weren't what they had hoped for, and that in the opinion of the entire team, they shouldn't wait any longer. We have an opening in the surgical schedule tomorrow morning, the doctor said, and I recommend that you take it. Julian stood in the hospital hallway with his coat still in one hand and said, yes, tomorrow morning. We'll take it. Then he ended the call and remained there for a while, because he knew exactly what tomorrow morning was. The hearing had been scheduled for weeks. The records had already been submitted. The board had set aside the time, and they had made it very clear that this was the final time his case would be reviewed. If it was postponed, the file would be closed and wouldn't be opened again. He called the program attorney, the young woman who had been working beside him for months, and said, I can't be there. There was silence on the other end for several seconds before the woman asked whether he was certain, whether he understood what they were going to lose. Julian said, I understand. I understand very clearly. But my son goes into surgery at 7 o'clock. And I will be there when they take him in. And I will be there when they bring him back. And if I have to choose, I don't need even 1 second to decide. He remained in the Chicago hospital hallway until nearly midnight, writing his request to the Arizona board to have the matter heard in his absence by hand, writing it 3 times until the words were concise enough, then signing the authorization, photographing it, and sending it before the sky began to lighten. In the message, he wrote only 1 sentence explaining why, that his son was having surgery in Chicago that same morning, and he hoped the board would understand. That evening, father and son were together in a hospital room with a reclining chair beside the bed. Julian spread his coat across the chair, took off his shoes, then climbed onto the bed and laid down beside Oliver. Oliver wanted him to read the story about the rabbit who got lost in the forest, the book they had read so many times that the cover had gone soft and worn. Julian read, and when he reached the part where the rabbit found his way home, Oliver interrupted and said, "Daddy, you're reading it wrong. The rabbit has to ask the owl first." Julian said, "You're right. Daddy forgot. You read that part for me." Oliver recited the whole passage from memory, got a few words wrong, and giggled at himself. Then he lay quietly for a while, still holding his father's thumb the way he had since he was very small, and asked whether Daddy was scared about tomorrow. Julian thought about the room in Arizona where people would be talking about him the next day while he wasn't there. Thought about the door his son would be pushed through in the morning. And he decided not to lie. Yes, Daddy is scared. Oliver thought for a moment in the solemn way 4-year-old children sometimes do. Then he said, "Then just stay still, Daddy. Don't run. Grandma Ruth told me that. He said when you're scared, stay still. If you run, you'll fall." Julian lay there for a very long time after hearing that. Then he said, "All right, Daddy will stay still." He told Oliver about Ruth, about how he'd driven a school bus and knew the name of every child who rode with him, about how he grew tomatoes on the porch, and every season gave more of them to the neighbors than he kept for himself. And Oliver fell asleep somewhere in the middle of the story. Julian lay in the darkness listening to the steady sound of the equipment and the footsteps in the hallway outside. He thought about the past 4 years, thought about the nights he'd pushed a cleaning cart across the empty bus terminal, thought about a tin box filled with letters that had all been returned. And he understood that tomorrow people would decide what happened to his life in Arizona, a place several states away, while there was nothing he could do about it. Near dawn, his phone vibrated once. It was Alessandro. He had sent only one line. "I know what's happening tomorrow morning. Don't worry about what's happening in Arizona. Stay with your little boy." Julian read the message twice, then placed the phone face down. At 6:45, they came to wheel Oliver's bed away. Julian walked beside it with one hand resting on the rail until they reached the door he wasn't allowed to pass through. He bent down, kissed his son's forehead, and said, "Daddy will be right here waiting. Remember that. Right here." Oliver lifted one hand and waved, the same little wave he used at the school gate every morning, and then the door closed. Julian sat down on the row of plastic chairs outside the operating room, placed both hands on his thighs, and stayed still, exactly the way his little boy had told him. In Arizona, the hearing room opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. The public seating was nearly full because the video from the airplane still hadn't faded from people's memory. The chair reserved for the petitioner was empty. The presiding officer read Julian's request to have the matter heard in his absence, including the handwritten reason he'd given. An attorney for the airline immediately stood and asked that the case be closed, saying that if the petitioner wasn't present, there was nothing further to consider. That was when a man stood up from the very last row. "My name is Rhonda Lindqvist," he said. "I am the father of the young man who died on that emergency flight that night, and I am asking this board not to close this case." The entire room turned toward him. He said, "For the past 4 years, I have been the person going everywhere saying Julian was responsible. I wrote letters. I gave interviews. I did everything a father who lost his son could do. Now I am standing here asking you to keep this case open. And I hope you understand that I am not saying those words lightly." The presiding officer looked at him for a moment, then asked him to sit down and said the board would continue. The next person called forward was a man no one in that room expected to see. Alessandro Ricci entered with 3 federal attorneys, asked to be sworn in, and took the oath. He testified in the same calm voice he used for everything, never raising it once. He stated who he was, what his family was, and what kind of work he did. He testified that during the 2nd week after his father's death, he'd signed a distribution authorization he hadn't read, and that on the night of March 14th, the product that reached that emergency helicopter had passed through a document bearing his signature. He testified that it hadn't been an accident, that the medication had been systematically diluted for years, and that he'd turned over the entire record to federal authorities, including the pages carrying his own name. Then he came to the final part. And as he spoke, he turned toward the public seating. A few months ago, I stopped breathing on an airplane. And the person who came forward was a man whose records say his hands were no longer allowed to touch a patient. He knew that. He knelt down anyway. I am not standing here today to ask you to show him mercy. I am standing here to tell you that my family is the reason 4 years of his life were taken from him. And you made him pay that price for us. The next person was Walter Kimura. He stood and said, I was the man who signed the report that year. And then he told them why he'd signed it, leaving out nothing, including the part about his son. Halfway through, his voice broke, and he had to stop to drink some water. I have taught this profession for nearly 40 years, he said. And I still tell my students that the most dangerous person in an emergency room is the one who cannot say the 3 words, I don't know. But I did know. I knew. And I signed anyway. After that, Julian's attorney asked permission to submit a document that hadn't been part of the original case file. This is a letter from Ruth Vandermeer, the man who raised my client from the age of 12. Over 4 years, he sent this board 142 letters. Every one of them was returned unopened. I would like to read the last one. And she read it slowly, and there was no sound left in the room except her voice. When she reached the sentence where the old man had written that boy has never ruined anything in his life, he simply never had anyone standing on his side. One member of the board removed his glasses and raised a hand to his face. When she read the final line, I don't have any power, ladies and gentlemen. All I have is paper and stamps. Rhonda Lindqvist stood for the second time. He walked down the center aisle, trembling, and stood in the open space before the board, facing the empty chair reserved for Julian. I know he isn't here. I still need to say this. I hated you for 4 years. I prayed that you would never be allowed to do that work again. I said things that I am ashamed even to repeat now. Then he asked the question everyone in that room would remember for a very long time. Can you forgive me? No one answered him, because the only person who had the right to answer was sitting on a row of plastic chairs several states away. The presiding officer struck the gavel, suspended the hearing, ordered the entire case referred for reinvestigation, and said the final determination would be sent to the petitioner in writing. Silvio Ricci was arrested that afternoon in his own office. He didn't deny a single thing. He stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, held out both hands, and while they went through the procedure, he looked at Alessandro standing at the far end of the room and smiled. You think I came up with that? Silvio said. You're more naive than I thought, Alessandro. That operation existed before I was ever allowed a seat at the table. I only inherited it. And I kept it running because it was the only thing left that could still feed the dozens of families in this house after you cut everything else away. He said, Go ask your father. Oh, that's right. You can't ask him anymore. There was only the sound of the handcuffs locking shut. Then they led him away, and no one said anything else. That night, Alessandro remained alone with the 2 boxes of records and began tracing everything backward. He worked his way through the years, through company names that changed again and again, through renewal contracts following one another with the steady rhythm of breathing. And he found the thing he had wanted to find while praying he never would. The thread began during his father's time. His father had built the operation himself, cleanly, carefully, hidden among legitimate businesses, and it had run quietly for years. Then his father died. And during the first week, Alessandro sat in that chair among hundreds of documents waiting for signatures. A 30-year-old man who had just buried his father, and signed a renewal without reading it. On the same afternoon, with the same pen, in the same stack as dozens of harmless papers. Alessandro sat motionless for a very long time with that page in his hands. For months, he'd been searching for the person who had destroyed Julian Hollis's life. He'd reconstructed every night, every shipment, every signature. And now he knew that person hadn't been hiding anywhere. That person had been sitting in his own chair for 4 years, signing papers without reading them, and believing he was cleaning up the family. 3 days later, Alessandro went to headquarters for the last time before surrendering himself. Several people were still sitting in the long dining room, and when he passed through, they all stood at once. Following a habit the family had carried through 3 generations, a habit no one could even remember beginning. Alessandro stopped. He looked at each of them. Then he said, "Starting today, don't stand anymore. No one in this family will ever have to stand because someone walks into a room. No one here is greater than anyone else." He said, "You do business with papers you have actually read. Read every line. Read the pages people tell you to sign quickly. Go home and eat dinner with your husbands and wives and children. And make sure you can sleep at night. That is everything I leave behind. Other than that, I leave you nothing." Then he walked toward the door, and not one person sat down. At the same time, several states away, Julian Hollis was sitting on the row of plastic chairs outside the surgical unit in the exact place where he'd been since 7 o'clock that morning. When the doctor came out, lowered his mask, and told him the surgery had gone well, that his son would be moved into recovery in about an hour, and that Julian should try to rest before they let him go in, Julian said thank you, and he said it twice. Then he sat down and lowered his face into both hands. His phone vibrated. It was his attorney, saying the board's letter had just been issued and a digital copy was attached. Julian opened it right there in the hallway, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and the sound of cartwheels rolling across the floor. The letter was 2 pages long, filled with references to statutes and provisions. His eyes moved across without being able to absorb until he reached the final line. The board concluded that the previous findings against Mr. Julian Hollis had been issued on the basis of false information, that every adverse notation in his record was to be removed, and that his professional license was fully restored, effective as of the date of the order. Julian read that line 3 times. Then he closed the phone, rested his head against the wall behind him, and in that hospital hallway close to noon, the man who had spent 4 years cleaning floors sat completely still because 2 things had been returned to him in the same morning, and he didn't know how to hold them both. That evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep peacefully in the recovery room, Julian opened the tin box again and took out the bank envelope he'd ignored that night in Nashville. Inside was the mortgage agreement for the house, signed 4 years earlier, only a few months after the day everything had fallen apart. And beneath it were the papers establishing a trust fund in Oliver Hollis's name. The amount wasn't large. It had never been enough to cover even half the cost of the surgery, and anyone who glanced at the hospital bill would have known that immediately. The old man must have known it too. Tucked among the papers was a small handwritten note containing only a few lines. Ruth had written, "This is all I could gather, sweetheart. I know it isn't enough. I've added it up over and over. But I thought if someone could start you off with half, maybe you'd have enough strength to go looking for the other half. People don't need miracles, sweetheart. They just need one person willing to begin first." Julian sat on the plastic chair in the hospital hallway and understood why the house was being taken. Understood that the man who had braided his hair when he was 12 years old had died inside a house that no longer belonged to him, and that he'd hidden the truth for 4 years because he knew Julian would have refused the money if he'd known. The other half, Julian learned later, came from a community fund, and the man who organized it was Rhonda Lindqvist. The father who had hated Julian for 4 years had gone from door to door through the very town that had once cursed his name, and he'd collected enough to cover what was missing. Alessandro came to the hospital straight from court, still wearing his suit. He stood outside the glass door looking in for a while before Julian stepped into the hallway. Julian said, "He made it." Alessandro said, "So did you." Then he handed Julian a paper showing the schedule for his sentence. "Don't wait for me. I'm not asking you to do that. And I don't have the right to ask." Julian took the paper, folded it, and slipped it into his coat pocket. He said, "You don't get to decide for me who I wait for." 3 years later, on a bright morning filled with sunlight, an old car was parked across the street from the gate of a correctional facility. The man leaning against the driver's door wore the uniform of a mobile emergency medical team, the kind that traveled to small towns without clinics, the places where the system was most likely to forget people's names. Beside him stood a healthy 7-year-old boy who couldn't keep his feet still, holding a handmade sign high above his head with the words, "Welcome home," Alessandro written across it in uneven letters. And in one corner, Oliver had drawn a little cloth bear named Pepper. The man who walked through the gate carried a paper bag in one hand, with no car waiting for him and no one beside him. When he saw that sign, he stopped in the middle of the sidewalk for a long time before crossing the street. Alessandro reached Julian first. He didn't speak. He just looked at him, looked at the uniform, at the steady hands, at the man who had knelt on an airplane floor and brought him back to life. Julian said, "You kept your promise. You opened the door. I walked through." Alessandro said, "I see that." Oliver tugged at Julian's sleeve. "Daddy, is he coming home with us?" Julian looked at Alessandro. "That's up to him." Alessandro knelt down until he was level with Oliver. "If your daddy will have me." Oliver considered this very seriously, the way 7-year-old boys do. Then he said, "Pepper says yes, but you have to be careful with his arm." Daddy sewed it back on, and it's still a little weak. Alessandro looked up at Julian, and for the first time in his life, the man who had never once been told no found himself hoping for a single yes. Julian held out his hand. "Let's go home." Alessandro took it, and the three of them walked toward the car together, leaving the gate behind them. This story leaves us with a few very simple things. A person's worth doesn't come from the work they do, the amount of money in their bank account, or the judgment the world has placed upon them. It comes from what they choose to do when someone needs them. Family isn't only the place we're born into. Sometimes family is the person who chooses us and stays. And the person who damages another life most deeply isn't always some cruel or evil figure. Sometimes it is simply someone signing a page they couldn't be bothered to read. Which means every careless thing we do today may become a burden someone else has to carry for years. Living with kindness and doing our work carefully are already ways of protecting other people. If this story touched your heart, please share it so that others can find it too. Tell someone today that you see them, that you see who they really are, not what the world has told them they are. Because sometimes, that's all a person needs to hear.